Okay, so if I could just have your attention, what I want to do, let me essentially describe what we are going to do today. We're going to go through a few more considerations having to do with the question of political economy in India. More broadly, the rubric under which I've been discussing everything for you is the question of development and well-being. So I want to say a fair bit about that today, and during the course of that discussion, I think I'm also going to start describing to you a little bit about the caste system in India, because there are certain questions that come up when one looks at the question of political economy and development and well-being, which obviously have to do with caste as well. For those of you who review the syllabus every week, you would have noticed that I'd mentioned in the syllabus for the section having to do with economics and well-being, that there's an article by Gardner Harris. So this is on page 5 of the syllabus, an article by Gardner Harris that was published in the New York Times. And it says that we shall analyze this article to see what are also some of the acute problems in representing India. So I'm actually going to spend about maybe 10-15 minutes going through this article, which is an article that came out about a few months ago in the summer, and describes why it is perhaps that India has the largest number of children who are malnourished in the world. And that's not merely because India's population is very large, but as a percentage of the population, India accounts for a huge number of malnourished children in the world, right? So the broad consideration to also keep in mind, not just for the lecture today, but for the subsequent 2 to 3 weeks, is that even though the syllabus segments economics and politics and caste issues into separate categories, there will be times when we will have to actually look at all of these together, because it's quite difficult to segment certain kinds of questions and simply say, well, it has to do with economics and doesn't have to do with anything else. I mean, that's seldom the case. And the reason why we, of course, make these analytical distinctions and separations is because it's sometimes easier to deal with some of the material and to understand a certain set of questions, both from the political point of view and then from the economic standpoint, and obviously from the social standpoint. So if you look at, for example, lower caste children in India, or lower caste people as a whole, and why they haven't done well, well, obviously it has to do not simply with their social status, but it has to do with their access to social goods. It has to do with their access to the political system, right? And this would be a very simple illustration of where, as I said, it's actually going to be quite difficult to do this segmentation. Now, before I begin the formal lecture, let me just recapitulate some of the points that I'd made in my previous lecture. What I tried to suggest to you was the following. Number one, that there are significant regional differences in India. So that if you go down to the state of Kerala, this is the illustration I'd given to you in my previous lecture, you find that Kerala actually does very well. Right? It does very well in what respect? For example, the maternal mortality rate, infant mortality rate, these are quite low. And these rates are comparable to rates that you find in industrialized countries in the West. Right? Or if you look at the literacy rate, we're talking about 90% or more. In some districts of Kerala, 99%, which is exactly what you would expect in Scandinavia, or most parts of the United States or Canada, so forth and so on. And then on the other hand, there are states in central India, in North India, where you're going to find the literacy rate for females, in particular in some districts, to be as low as 3 to 10%. If it happens to be an Adivasi population, Adivasis are the tribal people or the aboriginal people, right? The rates of literacy among women, among girls, may in fact be as low as 3%. So we're speaking about immense differences, and these differences are regional. There are differences between males and females. There are differences between upper castes and lower castes. All right, and this is what I mean when I say that that you should keep in mind these broad differences within India itself. Because one of the things that Amartya Sen and Jean Drèze do, and I think they do a rather good job at it, is to in fact suggest that the comparisons that we make have to be several kinds, because we make comparisons of India with, for example, other countries in South Asia. Then you can make a comparison of India with China. Why China? Because, of course, these are the two largest growing economies. But not only that, the reason the comparison with China is, in fact, a valid one in some respects from the point of view of studying the question is that back in 1990, roughly India and China were at the same spot. They were at the same level with respect to the level of development. And then, of course, the question arises, why is it that China's simply outpaced India considerably? Okay? And this is why we had brought in another set of considerations in my previous lectures, and that had to do with what is the relationship, very briefly, between development and authoritarianism. Right? Is it the case that certain states might actually develop faster if they are under authoritarian rule? And why might that, in fact, actually induce more development? Because, frankly, democracy is a messy and muddlesome affair. Democracy means that if you want to have a development project and the people in that area object for various reasons, well, then you have to listen to their voice, right? What else is democracy except to be able to listen to their voices? And we're not saying, of course, that in all parts of India, the state or those agencies that are invested in the project of development, that they're actually willing to listen to the people of India. But to some extent, you do have a political system that, in fact, actually says that, well, let's understand what people really want. Right? Now, in an authoritarian state, you don't have to worry about this. Singapore would be the classic example of an authoritarian state. For decades, that was able to come up with an enormous rate of development. Right? And these were the East Asian tigers, as they used to be called. And some of those economies have slowed down in more recent years, but on the whole, we can say that there has been a relationship between development and authoritarianism. So, in the lectures that in the previous lecture and in fact in some of the comments that I'd made before, not only had we then spoken about the way in which we can do some comparison and some of the regional differences that we have in India, and as I said, these differences may also be differences having to do with caste and gender, but also, to just complete my recapitulation of what I said in my previous lecture, I had pointed out to you that when India commenced development, when it started on this path, post 1947, essentially what India was committed to was centralized state planning. And then they had a planning commission. And this is the sort of thing that I described to you in some detail. Now let me move on to some other considerations to try to fill up this picture. And one of the first things I want to do is I want to look at this article by Gardner Harris. It's called Poor Sanitation in India. You have the URL on your syllabus, so you should go and read it. Poor sanitation in India may afflict well-fed children with malnutrition. It's a rather long article. It appeared on the first page of the New York Times on July 13th of this year. And this is how it begins. He wore thick black eyeliner to ward off the evil eye. But Vivek, a tiny 1-year-old living in a village of mud huts and diminutive people, had nonetheless fallen victim to India's great scourge of malnutrition. It is a question being asked, so why was Vivek malnourished? It is a question being asked, I'm going to omit some paragraphs, it's a question being asked about children across India, where a long economic boom, right, this long economic boom we have not yet spoken about because this has to do with the neoliberalization policies that were introduced in India roughly around 1990, when India's foreign exchange reserves were completely depleted. India had no foreign exchange reserves, 1989, 1990, and then India went basically to the World Bank and said that, well, we need some assistance, and essentially, you know what the World Bank does, right, and what the International Monetary Fund do. What these two organizations do when a country goes to them for aid is they say that, well, these are the conditions that we're going to impose upon you. If you're willing to abide by these conditions, we'll help you out. And usually these conditions mean, of course, that you open up the economy, you remove the tariffs, the import substitution policies that India had, that those had to be abandoned. In other words, you make your markets receptive to foreign investment and make the climate hospitable so that foreign companies can start working in that climate. Right? That's essentially what it means, and that's pretty much what India agreed to in 1989-90, which is the onset of this thing called neoliberalization. Right? And we are still in the midst of that 25 years later, and this is what's going to lead to what is called the economic boom, the rise of the middle class. I want you to table that aside for a minute, because one of the questions we want to come back to is, well, what do we mean when we talk about the middle class? Yes?
What year did India go to the World Bank?
1989-90, because that's when the foreign exchange reserves of India were completely depleted, and you basically had what you might call zero growth. Right? So now, so this is what the reference to the economic boom, so it is a question, why was Vivek malnourished? It is a question being asked about children across India, where a long economic boom, i.e. 1990 and thereafter, has done little to reduce the vast number of children who are malnourished and stunted, leaving them with mental and physical deficits that will haunt them their entire lives. Now, an emerging body of scientific studies suggests that Vivek and many of the 162 million other children under the age of 5 in the world who are malnourished are suffering less a lack of food than poor sanitation. Right? So this is fundamentally what the article is about, that the huge number of children who are malnourished in India, this malnourishment may be a consequence not simply of the lack of food, and in many cases it may have nothing to do with the lack of food, but it may have a great deal to do with poor sanitation. But that's a hypothesis. I mean, and of course this article is about a couple of scientific studies that seem to support this argument. But we want to see what else is going on in this piece, because one of the things that we have to worry about is, how do we write about another country, right? Particularly a country where, for example, malnourishment is so high, where 50% of the children are malnourished, and where 80% of the population, a statistic that you're probably sick of hearing by now, but where 80% of the population is living on virtually next to nothing. $1 a day, $1.50 a day. Right? But the question is, how do we think about another culture under these conditions? Right? And what are some of the hazards? Because you're going to find that I have some problem. Now, there are a lot of middle-class Indians who are very uncomfortable reading this, because, of course, middle-class Indians would like to think of India as a country that's an emerging power. They like to think of India as a country that's going to be a major player in the world. Well, how do you be a major player in the world? You've got atomic bombs, you're a nuclear power, you've spent a space mission to Mars, but obviously there are basic things that you cannot attend to. And these basic things, in fact, affect the vast majority of the population of the country. Right? That's the anomaly. So that's why the Indian middle class is always uncomfortable. Now, there used to be this filmmaker, he passed away some 20-25 years ago, India's most famous filmmaker. His name is Satyajit Ray. If you've only grown up on Bollywood films, you wouldn't know him, because he doesn't make Bollywood films, he made films in Bengali. But he was India's most well-recognized director abroad. And he made the kinds of films that go to film festivals, right? And then they win awards and nobody watches them back home in India. And why do I mention him? Because he was accused of exporting India's poverty to the rest of the world. Because his films were all set, his early films were all set in rural Bengal, and you just saw the sheer poverty in which people were growing up. And so people said, well, why do we need to export this idea of India to the rest of the world? Why don't we keep this to ourselves? All right, so this was the central issue. But I think it's important for us to address these issues, because obviously, if we're looking at what's happened in India post-1947, and we're saying that, well, it seems as if the Constitution of India, which is a grand document, that frankly this constitution has completely failed the vast majority of the people. On the other hand, it's also important to recognize that there are problems in how Western scholars in particular and Western journalists talk about a country such as India. Right? So you'll see as I move along in just a couple of minutes what some of the problems might be. Like almost everyone else in their village, I'm going back to the article and quoting him, Vivek and his family have no toilet. And the district where they live has the highest concentration of people who defecate outdoors. As a result, children are exposed to a bacterial brew that often sickens them, leaving them unable to attain a healthy body weight no matter how much food they eat. These children's bodies divert energy and nutrients away from growth and brain development to prioritize infection-fighting survival, said Jean Humphrey, a professor of human nutrition at Johns Hopkins. When this happens during the first 2 years of life, children become stunted. What's particularly disturbing is that the lost height and intelligence are permanent. So this is what I was referring to in passing in my comments in my last lecture when I pointed out that there are some forms of malnourishment from which the child will not recover. If it becomes acute and chronic over a period of time, it's irreversible. There's some forms of malnourishment which are reversible. If you catch it early enough, the child's not had it for a very long period of time, it may not actually affect brain development. But then there are other forms of malnourishment which are permanent. Now the author says, why are Indian children so much more malnourished than their poorer counterparts in sub-Saharan Africa? Okay? An interesting point here, because the countries that are the worst off in the world, other than the countries in South Asia, that is India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and so on, and Nepal, are the countries of sub-Saharan Africa. But in this respect, India is in fact worse off even than those countries. A child raised in India is far more likely to be malnourished than one from the Democratic Republic of Congo, Zimbabwe, or Somalia, the planet's poorest countries. And I can tell you, not the kind of countries that India would like to be compared with, right? Stunting affects 65 million Indian children under the age of 5, including a third of children from the country's richest families, right? Which would suggest that it's not only the lack of food that's a problem. This disconnect between wealth and malnutrition is so striking that economists have concluded that economic growth does almost nothing to reduce malnutrition. So if economic growth doesn't reduce malnutrition, what does? Improved sanitation, right? That's the implication. And you do know, by the way, from what happened in the 19th century, the mid-half of the 19th century in Europe, that what all the studies have done, people who worked in public health and the history of public health have shown that 90% of the improvement in life expectancy, in people's well-being, had to do not with improved medicines, which is a general feeling that people have. It simply had to do with improved nutrition, sanitation, and hygiene. That once people have been taught that, well, after you've gone to the toilet, you should go and wash your hands with soap. You know, you will think that it's elementary. Well, these are things that it's like training children. It takes a long time before this idea becomes lodged into your mind, right? So that's what we mean. And of course, it means elimination of open defecation. It's also important to remember that even in Europe, until the first half of the 19th century, there was simply no way in which you could eliminate human waste that was not degrading. And if you read early 19th century English literature, you'll be surprised to find that very often people would simply throw feces from, if they're living on a second floor, they would just simply throw it down the window onto the street. If you look at records of Edo, Edo is the older name for Tokyo, a very common phenomenon, exceedingly common phenomenon. Now we're not talking about antiquity, we're talking about the first half of the 19th century here, okay? So you have to keep that in mind. Half of India's population, the article continues, or at least 620 million people defecate outdoors. 620 million people, half the population, okay? And while this share has declined slightly in the past decade, an analysis of census data shows that rapid population growth has meant that most Indians are being exposed to more human waste than ever before. In Sheohar, the place where this person did some of his quote, field work. For instance, a toilet building program between 2001 and 2011 decreased the share of households without toilets to 80% from 87%. Right? Only a decrease of only 7%. Okay, decreased the share of households without toilets to 80% from 87%. But population growth meant that exposure to human waste rose by 50%. Right? And so forth and so on. Now let me get to the last part of what I'm interested in, because the article is several pages. We're not going to go through all of it, but I want you to now alert you to what are some of the problems and how the writer is thinking about this. And it's, in a sense, a kind of a cautionary note for you when you look at the material about how you should be interpreting some of this material, right? India's stunting problem represents the largest loss of human potential in any country in history. And it affects 20 times more people in India alone than HIV/AIDS does around the world, said Lakshmi Narayan, Vice President for Research and Policy at the Public Health Foundation of India. It's a staggering figure. Nobody thinks about it, right? But it's entirely true. I mean, the amount of media attention that has been generated in India about HIV and AIDS, and I'm not saying it shouldn't be, because of course it's a problem. But what he's saying over here is that this stunting problem is 20 times greater if you include all the HIV and AIDS cases around the world, not just in India. I mean, that's the magnitude of the problem that you're talking about. India is an increasingly risky place to raise children. Right? Now, what does that mean? Now, this is an interesting, generalization, right? Increasingly risky place to raise children. Because, of course, the question is, well, where are you being raised within India? What kind of facilities do you have? The country's sanitation and air quality are among the worst in the world. Parasitic diseases and infections like TB, often linked with poor sanitation, are most common in India. More than 1 in 4 newborn deaths in the world occur in India. Open defecation has long been an issue in India. This is an issue, by the way, that Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, addressed in his speech on August 15th. No Prime Minister of India, I've got lots of reservations about Narendra Modi, but I must say that no Prime Minister had the guts to do that before he did it in his August 15th speech. August 15th is Indian Independence Day, right? Okay? So no one before him had done that, and he addressed this issue on August 15th. Now look what he says. So open defecation has long been an issue in India. Some ancient Hindu texts advise people to relieve themselves far from home. Well, frankly, I don't think that's the case at all. Now, this is just material that he's inserted inside the article, right? Suggesting that, right, what's going on here? You have to think about it. Well, that this is a problem that you find in India from remote antiquity. But I just suggested to you that, in fact, this was a problem that was found all over the world until relatively recent times. Relatively recent, given the long span of history that we have. Okay? The cause of many of our diseases, said Gandhi, is a condition of our toilets and our own bad habit of disposing of excreta anywhere and everywhere. Other developing countries have made huge strides in improving sanitation. Just 1% of Chinese and 3% of Bangladeshis relieve themselves outside, compared with half of Indians. Attitudes may be just as important as access to toilets. Constructing and maintaining tens of millions of toilets in India would cost untold billions, a price many voters see no need to pay. How did he arrive at this conclusion? Right? A recent survey found that many people prefer going to the bathroom outside. So what implication would you draw? Supposing I gave you this passage in the final exam and said, what is he saying here? Yeah.
It's a specific cultural preference, like certain people, like I was saying, don't have.
So this is a lifestyle choice. People in India would rather just shit outside than shit inside. Right? That's what he's saying.
Yeah.
Yeah? Lifestyle choice. Right? And Okay, yeah. See, it seems to me that what he's saying is a recent survey found that many people prefer going to the bathroom outside. You know, this is more or less built into the DNA of Indians. Yeah, we'd just rather go outside. Of course, I want to know what the 3 million Indians in this country are doing. Maybe they're doing, maybe secretly they're, you know, right? And, you know, in their lawns, because they're all living in nice homes, most of them, so they've got very big lawns, and maybe secretly they go at night and they just live out their DNA, right? You see, this is, look how he's building it up. A recent survey found, okay, what survey are we talking about? How representative is this survey? You know, who did you do the survey with? Are there 500 such surveys that, no. See, this is how the writer now has moved from what is ostensibly an objective description of facts to a subjective assessment of the attitude of Indians. Right? This is what you have to do when you look at the piece. Look at the transition. Yes?
I think he's talking about the fact that probably where he did his field work, that due to a lack of adequate sanitation and access, is that for many to find an adequate place to go use the restroom, maybe it's so time consuming and they lose time perhaps for work or something, personal issues that, then I don't know, it could be just one hypothesis.
Yeah, it's look, you can always, it's always possible to come up with a charitable reading. The problem here is that, for example, I've read every article that he's written in the New York Times on India. So when he talks about religion, for example, Hindu-Muslim conflict, for him it's timeless. It's always happened. So what you have to do is you have to then extrapolate. You have to see how you would use a certain kind of interpretive style to understand, because notice that even if you don't agree with my assessment, let's say, notice that he's moved from the objective. So here are the facts. These are the number of people who do this. Okay, these are the number of kids in India who die, etc., etc., etc. And now he's moved from that to something that is, of course, entirely subjective. Right? And of course, then I would have to ask, well, what does Mr. Harris know about India? Just because he's been sent by the New York Times with a nice big fat check, okay, to spend a couple of days in this little village, and then he's going to give me a whole narrative about the lifestyle choices of Indians and the fact that these are recommended in ancient texts. Complete nonsense, frankly, you know. All right. So, as I said, you know, you might say that, well, this was, he simply interviewed a few people, a recent survey. I don't know what this recent survey is, because when he gives you the facts, by the way, then he tells you what the source is. Such and such study done by such and such person at Johns Hopkins University. Now, what is this survey here? It's his personal survey. Let me go and talk to 10 people and see, would you rather just defecate outside or would you rather defecate in a toilet? You know? And of course, if the toilets are very poorly maintained, which they are in many places publicly, well, you wouldn't want to go there, you know, right? Because you would have to have a much more elaborate account at that point. So I'm just simply suggesting to you that this kind of slippage is the most common thing that you find in articles of this kind. Okay? So we won't go over it, but now, of course, you've learned a few things, unpleasant as they might be, about what is it that we mean when we talk about development, okay, and or the lack of it in a country such as India. Now, there were 3 things I had written on the board in my previous lecture, which I did not get to, and I said I would. One had to do with the growth of the middle class. One had to do with the evisceration meaning the elimination of the commons. Okay, and neoliberalization policies, which commenced, as I said, in 1990, 1991, 1989 to 1991. The person who was largely responsible for that was the man who would subsequently become the Prime Minister of India much later on. I'm talking about Manmohan Singh, who was the Prime Minister of India until his party lost the elections this year. Okay, and when I say neoliberalization policies, as I mentioned to you, foreign exchange reserves in India had gone down. They had been completely depleted. And so what is neoliberalization policies? Lower tariffs, lower subsidies, direct foreign investment. You make the economic climate hospitable for direct foreign investment. And when I say direct foreign investment, it also means such things as the Indian government saying that, well, we're not going to insist. Okay, we're not going to insist that foreign companies invest their profits in India itself. If you want to repatriate your profits, take them out of the country, you can do that. You know, there was Coca-Cola was banned from India for a couple of years. It was banned from India because one of the things that the Indian government wanted was they wanted Coke to make sure that they did not repatriate their profits, take them out of the country. They said, if you're making profits in India, you've got to reinvest them back in India. And Coke said, we don't agree. And so the Indian government said, well, if you don't agree with that condition, then we're going to throw you out. And they did. They threw it out, of course, but you know, getting rid of Coke is not an easy matter, because this is what it means to be a brand name. And what the Indian government did was they encouraged a drink called Campa Cola. It didn't really catch on. And eventually Coke had to be invited back. That's another long story. Okay? But that's an illustration of where you get a certain kind of nationalism about some of these issues. So when we're looking at neoliberalization policies, what we're really talking about, as I said, is you essentially make the economic climate hospitable for foreign companies. They should feel as though they're wanted. And of course, there were restrictions that were placed even then. So for example, in many of the industries, even when India implemented these neoliberalization policies, the stipulation was that, well, in the banking sector, for example, that only a certain percentage of a bank could be foreign owned. Okay, so they put restrictions. And many of these restrictions are still in place. And there are many vital industries, because the argument there, which to some extent is a sensible argument, is that you don't want to compromise all your industries, especially the vital industries, by making them entirely foreign owned, because you're completely hostage to them. Right? And so generally it meant that it had to be less than a majority share. So in many of these vital industries, the foreign investment could not be more than 49.5%. Because if it was over 50%, then of course it was majority owned, and then the majority stakeholders or shareholders would be able to make the decision. One of the other things that was entailed by the neoliberalization policies is what is called special economic zones. So you'll see quite a bit of discussion about this in some of the literature, not very much in the reading that you have, but if you ever see a discussion of this in newspapers, you'll know what it means. SEZs, special economic zones. What do special economic zones mean? Very briefly, what it means is an enclave, a territory, in a certain state that has effectively been handed over to a foreign company. So let's supposing Honda or Toyota decides to set up an automobile production plant. Now, let's say you turn this automobile production plant into a special economic zone. Okay, there might be a production plant which is not a special economic zone, but let's supposing you turn it into a special economic zone. What would that mean? It would mean that the labor laws of India would not apply in this special economic zone. It would mean that the taxes that the company would have to pay, the foreign taxes it would have to pay, the duties it would have to pay, would be eliminated or would be greatly reduced. Right? So these special economic zones, giving you two examples of what some of the consequences of these special economic zones were: elimination of labor laws of India, which are pretty stringent. Of course, they never followed in any case, if you ask me, right? But the labor laws would not apply. And secondly, the foreign company for which this special economic zone had been set up, it would essentially be able to operate without any regulation. Right? So this is what was done, and of course in many parts of India where these special economic zones began to be set up, particularly in areas having to do with mining. You know that mining is probably one of the most contentious issues all over the world. Wherever you have mining, you have huge profits to be made, particularly because many of the mining concerns are based in tribal areas. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment, in tribal areas where the consequences are very severe. One of the reasons why they operate, of course, in tribal areas is because in most tribal communities, property rights are not written into the law. So in India, you should know, there is a law which forbids sale, transfer, and exchange of property from tribal areas to people who do not belong to those communities. Okay? So in other words, if I'm a tribal and I'm living in a certain area, I'm part of a tribal community, the land where I live cannot actually by law be sold to a person who does not come from an Adivasi or tribal community. It cannot, in principle. So of course, now but the problem is that this is precisely the land where most of the mineral wealth is to be found. Most of the mineral wealth is to be found in these tribal areas. And this is true in India, it's true in Burma, it's true in Thailand, it's true in a large number of countries. It's true in Australia, by the way, where most of the mineral wealth is to be found in areas where you have large Aboriginal populations. Okay? So, of course, now the question is, well, how is a company then going to do it? And so one of the things that you do is that instead of actually saying that the land has been sold, you simply give the company some rights and you create a special economic zone. So in exchange for these rights, a company pays very little. Very, very little. Right? That would be a typical way in which you would circumvent what is otherwise an exceedingly progressive law. Because in this matter, as in many others, one of the things you'll find out is that the Indian government has extraordinarily progressive laws. In fact, I would go so far as to say that India probably has the most progressive social legislation in the world on most issues, and probably has the worst record for implementing this legislation, whether it has to do with the rights of tribals or the rights of Dalits, or any number of other things that one can think about. And we're going to look at some of these rights that people have and what has happened to some of these rights. Okay? So this was one of the consequences of the neoliberalization policies, was the creation of these special economic zones. Now, one of the other consequences was the growth of the middle class. I want to enter into this question by having you look at this slide. Does anybody recognize this building over here? This 27-story skyscraper? Yeah. Okay. So you want to tell the class? You're absolutely right.
So he's a corporate magnate that practically controls every major public sectors, whether it's textiles or entertainment or electricity, and that's his house. I want to say it's like, if you put two of the neuroscience buildings on top of each other, that's how big it is, and it has all the amenities.
So this is the private residence of Mukesh Ambani. It is the most expensive private residence in the world. It's valued, according to Forbes 2014, at $1 billion US dollars. Private residence. 27 stories. 4 stories dedicated simply to parking. 600 servants who live on the premises. Check out Forbes 2014. Check out the internet. I don't have to make this up. It's all there. It's called Antilla, which is the name of a mythical island. And yes, indeed, this is an island because it's an island of obscene wealth in the midst of slums. Now, what is the beautiful view that Mr. Ambani gets when he stands on the 25th floor balcony to get some fresh air from the sea, right? Because the sea is very close by. Well, on one side is a sea, on the other side, slums. Slums. I mean, the entire wealth of some of these slums is not equivalent to the cost of this building. That's what we're talking about. Okay? The private residence of one Indian corporate magnate, Mukesh Ambani. He's got a brother as well. If you add his brother's wealth to his wealth, then we've got another, set of considerations. But luckily, the two of them fought. So it's not together. Well, of course, it just means that both of them now are generating their own private empires, which they've been doing for a while, of course, right? So this is not the middle class, needless to say. But the reason why I'm showing you this is because we cannot consider the middle class unless we consider also one other question. In tandem, I'm going to consider both of them together. And that is a question that Mr. Sainath had addressed very briefly. And I think he did so more in the evening, but most of you were not there, and you weren't required to come to it, so I'll have to rehearse a little bit of that, and that is growing inequalities in India. And these inequalities have sharpened since the neo-liberalization policies of 1989-90. Now, most Indians do not want to hear about that, because what they would rather talk about is, and I think there is something to be said for that, about something called the growth of the middle class. But before we can understand what the growth of the middle class really means, it might be useful to understand what we mean by the middle class. So what is a middle class? Would anybody venture forth with a description? Yes, Dominic.
It's an economic and social class where people make more than the cost of living, and they end up with a nice chunk of money to spend on leisure activities. They're also generally well educated.
Okay, certain degree. So the middle class is a class of people that makes more than is needed for the requirements of life and has some money left over for leisure, right? That's the definition. I like the definition. Yeah.
Also, like just add that it's a class that can be able to purchase consumer products.
Okay. Keyword. You brought in another keyword. You said consumer products. If you don't mind, what I'm going to simply do is I'm going to translate that into one single word: consumption. Okay? Middle class is a class of people, according to this definition. Now, that doesn't mean I necessarily agree, but I think that there's an element here that would have to be taken very seriously. Right? The middle class is a class of people who are capable of having some levels of consumption. Okay? Right? Anything else that you associate with the middle class? When did the middle class arise in the United States, do you think?
After World War II.
After World War II. There was no middle class in the United States before?
There was a very small one, but the Great Depression wiped a lot of it out. It had to be
Yeah, but the Great Depression was just immediately preceding World War II. I mean, for example, if you look at the United States in the 1880s, 1890s, it actually is now becoming a major player in the world economy. Not, of course, to the extent to which it's going to be a major player after World War II. I agree over there. The automobile industry is going to kick off in a big way long before the Great Depression. Long before the Great Depression. Right? I mean, the Great Depression, what it did was it essentially put a brake on the economic progress that the United States was going through, which had been going on for several decades. So you could say that there is obviously an expansion of the middle class after World War II. If you said that again, I would agree with that. But the middle class did not arise in the United States in the 20th century. When did the middle class come about? I mean, it's very important that we understand this, because it'll give us a comparative framework to think about the middle class in India. That's why I want to try to understand. Yes.
I'd say back even before the American Revolution, the middle class was generally the traders and the merchants and those who made their living off of.
Well, now I think we're going to the other extreme. I mean, because, look, before the American Revolution, so before, let's say, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, so before the 1770s, effectively, it would be difficult to speak of a middle class, because now let's go back to your definition, okay? And the other definition that's been offered, consumption. Well, you don't really have levels of consumption there. In fact, you don't have too many what you would call durable goods, right? What are you going to consume? I mean, you remember that the American Revolution, what were some of the protests about? The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Tea Act. Tea and sugar are two of the main goods. You don't really have consumption items Okay, so it would be very difficult to speak. And if you're talking about a group of people who have enough time left over for leisure, well, that's certainly not the case, frankly, in the second half of the 1700s, or even the first half of the 1700s, because if you look at the life of people back then, I mean, you're talking about long days of work. Okay? Hand at the back, over there, yeah. Middle class, are you all able to hear what he's saying? Up in the front here? No. Can you just speak up a bit?
If we didn't have the middle class, the tensions would be too high between the bottom and the top.
Yeah, but that's not, you're saying that if you didn't have a middle class, then there would be too much tension between the lower class and the upper class, right? Okay, no, but that's not a definition. That's simply telling me that, well, it's sort of like, it's a safety valve. That's what you're saying. It's a safety valve. That, you know, it provides the cushion between the extremes. But that's only telling me that it is, in fact, that the middle class is middle, right? But what is the middle class? How did it arise? What were the conditions under which it arose in the United States? Yes?
Oh, never mind. You said in the United States, but I was going to say, like, maybe England during, like, the Industrial Revolution?
Yes.
So
Okay, yes, but what happened after the Industrial Revolution that led? You're right, that if you look at the Western world, okay, the first middle class, in a manner of speaking, is to be found after the Industrial Revolution, some years after that, not immediately after that, okay, when obviously certain amount of wealth is created, and this wealth is now distributed a bit more evenly. Okay? It's not just a few people, the aristocratic landlords, which is what you used to find in England, and then people who were at the bottom. And the people at the bottom would be not the urban working class, because before the Industrial Revolution, you didn't really have much of an urban working class. You basically had people working in the farms and the countryside. Then once, of course, you have the Industrial Revolution, then you have an urban working class, the proletariat. And then you have the slums, which are eventually going to develop, so forth and so on. We're still missing, however, what you've said is largely true, but we're still missing what is a very crucial ingredient of the middle class. What is it that makes possible a middle class society in the United States? Now, what makes it possible, I want to suggest to you, is the following. Okay? Same thing could be said for England as well. What makes it possible is the idea of the commons. And let me explain what I mean by that. What I mean by the commons is the following, that a middle class arises when a sufficient number of people agree that there are certain social goods that need to be shared among people. What do I mean by certain social goods? In the United States, public education and the rise of public education is a very good indication of that. Okay? When did that happen? It happened in the 19th century. Right? Because what is public education? And why is it that some people, especially on the left, still get so agitated that this is their dream cause? Because what made possible the emergence of the middle class was this idea, which you can only have when you have a certain amount of wealth. Right? That's why the Industrial Revolution is important. Because when you have the Industrial Revolution, then a certain amount of wealth is generated. And then you say, well, when a certain amount of wealth is generated, what are the responsibilities of a state? And reciprocally, what are the responsibilities of the people? Okay? So, because in order to have public education, what do you need? You need a group of people who are willing to agree that the state should impose a certain amount of taxes. What are you going to fund public education with? You know, for example, all of you or your parents in most cases if you're in California, you own property, you pay property taxes. And have you ever seen a property tax bill? Go and take a look at the property tax bill, because it'll tell you what percentage of your property taxes are going towards the schools in your district. This all goes back effectively to the 19th century. And this is what I mean by social goods. Social goods are goods, we're not talking about consumable goods, we're talking about social goods. That there's a group of people, a sufficiently large number of people, who come to the realization that it is very important that certain things be made available to everyone. And that would include not just public education, it would include street lighting, street lights, a postal system. And some of this, the rudimentary aspects of it may go back to the 18th century, late 18th century, the very rudimentary aspects. You know, so for example, Benjamin Franklin and his investment in the idea of a postal system. But of course, the postal system really only developed in the 19th century. And what is a postal system? Where we say that it's a social good. We need the state to be able to carry out this function. And you have to remember that, of course, in the 19th century, this was the only way. Long before the telephone and telegraph came into place, the only way of mass communication. And everybody agreed, because what is a postal system being run with? It's a state subsidized. And people say, yes, a certain percentage of our taxes can go towards the creation of a postal system. Now, why am I saying all of this? I want you to be very clear about what's happening, because there's a very serious problem in India that we have to contend with. Okay? I want to suggest to you bringing together all the comments that have been offered today. And most of them are on target, except that each one of you is looking at a very small thing, and I'm trying to fill up the picture and suggest to you what are the ways in which we can connect something like consumption, for example, with the connection with something like the creation of a middle class in the post-industrial revolution phase. Okay? So what I want to suggest is the following. In India, unfortunately, the middle class is only a consuming class. When we say that there has been a growth in the middle class in India, number one, the idea of a middle class is a very subjective idea. It's a subjective idea because it's almost impossible to come to a precise definition. When you say that someone is super rich, well, we might disagree exactly what super rich means, but we have a pretty good idea. And I think that we can achieve a more or less a kind of a consensus. If I said that Bill Gates is super rich, no one in this room is going to disagree. But if I said that so-and-so in India is middle class, and you go to a middle class household in India, a typical middle class household would look like a slum in America. It would. Because a typical middle class household doesn't even have a car. They don't have a car. They may have one television, and it's not going to be a 40-inch flat screen with, Netflix on it. Okay? It's not. But you would expect that in a middle class household here today, broadly speaking. Of course, you can say there's a lower middle class, there's a middle class, and there's an upper middle class. Right? And then you can segment each so there's a lower upper class, middle upper, and upper upper. Upper upper would be Bill Gates, and well, they're upper upper and beyond, right? And similarly, in the lower class, there is a lower lower, middle lower, and upper lower. Right? So you can segment it 9 ways minimum here. And yes, we could say that there's some disagreement about, well, what exactly would be the differences between a lower middle, and upper middle, but by and large, that's what a sociologist would be able to tell you quite precisely. So if you have, for example, four 40-inch flat screen TVs, you're definitely not lower middle. You would have to be at least middle, probably upper middle, So forth and so on, okay? Now, what we are simply saying is that, in fact, actually, the middle class is a very elastic concept, very elastic. And that's why when you see figures for the middle class in India, you know, very often the sociologists will say 150 to 300 million. That's the figures that you often get. The reason you get this 150 to 300 million, we're not talking about a million or two, we're talking 150 million difference, is because, frankly, it's impossible to decide exactly who is a member of a middle class or not. Okay, so that's a sociological problem in how we exactly define it, because the concept is very elastic. Then we've got another set of issues, and that set of issues is that I want to suggest to you that, historically speaking, in countries such as the United States and Great Britain, the middle class was not simply, historically speaking, was not simply a consuming class. It was a class of people that agreed upon the idea of social goods. Okay, and the social goods would include a postal system, public education, a public library system, which is still superb despite all the cuts in the United States. Most counties, most states have a good functioning public library. And the people who are going to use it and who have used it historically are people who belonged to the middle class. Because again, to run a public library system, it means that a large number of people have to consent that yes, the state can tax us, and a portion of these taxes will be used to create a public library system. These are what I'm calling social goods. These are things that are good for everybody, even if everybody doesn't use them. Okay? And then thirdly, I'm suggesting to you that in fact in India, this idea of social goods or the commons, so things, social goods mean things that are in the commons. This idea of things in the commons, idea of social goods, this has been completely divorced from the middle class. The middle class in India is simply a class of people that engages in the act of consumption. And consumption means not simply going to the grocery store with a big, getting out your cart and, all right, let me dump 10, boxes of cereal and 4, packets of chips and, 8 Greek yogurts or whatever it is. That's consumption. But even going on a holiday, that's consumption. Leisure holidays, that's grown in India astronomically. Okay? And yes, if you're saying that neoliberalization policies created a middle class, it did, because of course it did it by sharpening the inequalities between people at the top and people at the bottom. Right? But I want to say a few more things about the consequences of this, which I think will make you understand fully exactly what the stakes are in this. I want to suggest to you that in India, with the middle class, the emergence of a middle class, and these neoliberalization policies, the middle class opted out of the state. The middle class opted out of the state. What I mean by that, very simply, is the following. That after neoliberalization policies came into place, most Indians decided that they were no longer going to be reliant upon state services, state-owned services, state-managed services. What would be some illustrations of that? In every domain of life, you can see that happening very clearly. So, for example, let's take the telephone system. Now, when I was growing up in India, and this is no exaggeration what I'm telling you, okay? When I was growing up in India, we first had a telephone in our home, and our home was what you would call a middle class home in India. And that's what I meant, that if you look at the American comparison, there's no comparison there at all. We did not have a telephone in our home until I was 22 years old in India. Okay? No telephone at all. And when I tell my daughter, she said, weren't there mobiles? I said, well, the word mobile didn't exist. And neither did the word landline. Because the word landline only came into existence when mobile phones came into existence. Okay? You know, if you called AT&T in 1970 and you wanted a telephone connection in the US, you know, you get it instantly. I mean, okay, maybe a day or two, right? They take your order, and even in 1970, when I first came in 1976, I was absolutely bewildered because within a day we could get. It took us 11 years to get a phone connection in India. That's why I was 22 before we got a phone connection at our home in India. And there was a state monopoly. Now when neoliberalization policies came in, and a few years after that, so you had a number of companies, telecommunications companies, and then of course a few years after that, you started having cell phones. Cell phones started coming in. So what did all the middle class people do? They simply opted out. They said, we're not even going to go to MTNL. MTNL is the state-managed company that provided a telephone service. That's the acronym, Mahanagar Telephone Nigam Limited. You don't have to worry about what it stands for, just MTNL. Okay? Right? So MTNL, most of the middle class, they simply opted out. Why? Because you go to a company called Airtel, and within 4 hours, you get a phone connection. But it's a private company. Okay? That's one illustration. Transportation. When I was growing up, Delhi, the city where I grew up, part of the time, I mean, partly I grew up elsewhere, but partly where I grew up, had a massive bus system. The largest bus system in the world, DTC, they're all acronyms, Delhi Transport Corporation. Okay? Now, it was a hellish experience, I can tell you that, especially for women. Because of course, and this is where you have to know Indian English, right? And this is part of studying the cultural history of India post-1947. You board a DTC bus, and on the back of every seat, in white, was written, "Eve teasing is strictly prohibited." Does anybody know what that means? Ever heard of that? Every single seat on the back of it, "Eve teasing is strictly prohibited." You know what that means? Anybody wants to make a guess? Yeah. Sorry? Yeah. Molesting women is prohibited. Eve, as in Adam and Eve, right? I mean, imagine, right? Eve teasing. Right? This is one of those wonderful Indianisms in English. There are thousands of them. You know? Okay? Eve teasing is strictly prohibited on the back of every. Because these buses, which were designed for 60 people, would have 200 people packed into them. And you couldn't move an arm or a leg. I mean, if you had to get off, 3 stops ahead, you had to start preparing your way 3 stops before to edge your way. Okay? And of course, when it's that packed, there are going to be men who are going to start groping women. Right? And that's why they had these signs. Eve teasing is strictly prohibited. On the back of every seat. So this was DTC, Delhi Transport Corporation. Now, after neoliberalization, what was going to happen? The development of the automobile industry. So what do the middle class do? They say, to hell with state transportation. We're just going to go in our car. Now, of course, if you go in your car, it's a form of social irresponsibility, frankly. Particularly in a country which is not an oil-producing country. It's not. Right? You have to import virtually all the oil. And you've already got sources of pollution and contamination that are, unmatched. And now you're going to add cars to the roads. And in many parts, even of the metropolitan city like Delhi, many parts, the roads were not fit for cars. They were fit for bullock carts, not for cars, frankly. I'm not talking about all of Delhi, of course, but there are parts of Delhi where it's just simply unpaved. I mean, the area where I grew up, which is considered to be, quote, an elite colony, okay, that's what they call them. Colony means, neighborhood. A relatively elite colony where I grew up in Delhi, right behind me was a forest. I mean, and there were snakes there, Okay, I'm not talking about a forest reserve. This is not like, an American forest reserve. Okay, I'm not talking about that. It's just people living right there, and there's, you know, open sewage and all kinds of things going on. Okay? That's what we're talking about. So, neoliberalization policies come in. Remember what I said. I'm saying in India, the middle class opted out of the state. What I mean by that is they say, we're going to have nothing to do with the state at all. Now, what's going to happen to all your social goods? Because the state provides public education. So, public education, let's take a third example now. So, I've given you two examples. Telephones, communication, mass communication, okay, and transportation. Education, best illustration of that. You see, if people with money decide that they're going to opt out of the state sponsored system of education, what's going to happen? What's going to happen is there's going to be a decline in public education as well. Because people who are rich or moderately wealthy are just simply better off than the people at the rock bottom. And that's exactly, by the way, what's happened in the US. UCLA faculty, 90% of them would not send their child to a public school. I can guarantee you that. Guarantee you that. Because they've got the money to do what? To send their kids to private school. And what, of course, that does is it leads to the erosion of quality of the public school. And that's why in some districts the public schools are in pieces here. Absolute pieces. I've got two kids who go to public schools, and I know, I mean, I'm absolutely shocked that in the wealthiest country in the world, you get requests from middle school teachers, oh, for baby wipes and for pencils. Like, what the, you know, is that all I've got time for now? Is, you know, go to the Walmart store and buy, you know, baby wipes for the school? I mean, it's ridiculous. Because they have allowed the public school system to slowly collapse. And why? Because there is an evisceration of the commons happening very slowly here. Very slowly. In India, it's almost gone all the way. There is no public library system anymore. We used to have one. It's virtually finished. Virtually finished. The public transportation, now in Delhi, of course, they've got a metro. So partly because the crush of people is so enormous. I mean, you've got 20 million people. Okay? So you have to do something. But of course, the bus system has collapsed. Because if you're wealthy, what do? Or if you're, as I said, not just wealthy, but just relatively well-to-do, you simply say, we're not going to use the state-funded sources at all. Yes, Mohammed? Oh, that's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. We haven't gotten yet to the question of taxation. Because do you know what percentage of the population of Pakistan, let's begin with Pakistan, what percentage of the population of Pakistan pays personal income tax? Anybody want to give me a number? Make a rough guess. Sorry? Less than 20. You're very, very generous. Make another guess. Very generous. 1.5%. 1.5% of the population of Pakistan pays personal income tax. In India, it's about 2.5%. That's it. What is that? It means, again, you have abandoned. Because you know your taxes are being used for things that rich will always say, or the middle class in India will say, why should I pay taxes? I don't use the DTC, okay? I don't use the Indian postal system, and they don't. Because they get everything by courier, everything. Okay, even book catalogs. You know, I get book catalogs since I'm a writer, and you know, I work with so I get even the book catalogs all come by courier in India to me. Yes. I couldn't hear you. You'll have to speak up a bit if you're sitting in the way back in the classroom. No. Well, okay. You see, there are a number of issues involved here. I mean, I think the essence of what you have to try to remember is the following. Okay, that a system of taxation itself. Let me just answer it this way. Okay, system of taxation itself commences when you have a notion of social goods. Why would you have a system of taxation? You have a system of taxation because there is an idea that there are certain things that the state will provide which everybody needs. Everybody needs a public library system. Everybody needs a public education system. Everybody needs a sewage system. When you don't have one, or you don't take care of it, then you have what happened to UCLA 6 weeks ago when 20 million gallons of water flooded. You see, because if you don't invest, it's a very good illustration, 100-year-old system. You're not investing in it. Why? Because there are people who are beginning to say, hey, you know, how does it concern me? How do these things concern me? I'm saying to you that this process is only started in America as of 2-3 decades ago. In India, and it's very slow. That's why you still have a public library system that works in this country. Okay? Of course, the books they get are awful, I think, but that's a different matter. You know, how to chicken soup for the soul, you know, all that crap. I mean, those are not books. That's garbage, basically, right? Okay? But nonetheless, they have a public library system. All right? You know, with some good multicultural writers, because all of them have to. Then you can show that you're properly multicultural. So, you know, let's get 10 African writers, 20 Indian writers, and get their books, you know. And of course, all libraries will do that. But you have a functioning public library system. In India, I'm saying all of this has completely collapsed. So you have an evisceration of the commons. Okay? Evisceration means it's finished. It's wiped out slowly. And you have a growth of the middle class, but the growth of middle class has accompanied the process of opting out of the state. When you opt out of the state and you happen to belong to the middle class, what it means is that all of these social services that were very good at one point, or were at least extensive, all of them begin to collapse and diminish. And this is part of the story of the political economy of India in the post-1947 period. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. I'll have a few more things very briefly to say about these things, and then I'm going to talk about politics. So that's the section that we have for this week. We're not really behind because, as I said, we've been talking about some of these issues, and I'm going to introduce some elementary remarks about the caste system as well, because I think that you need to start understanding what are some of the issues there.